Dawn breaks over Benson airfield on August 21st, 1940. The morning is crisp, cold at this hour before the sun has properly cleared the horizon. A Spitfire sits on the tarmac, its Merlin engine still quiet, but you can feel the anticipation thrumming through the very airfield itself. This is not a fighter on a combat patrol. Its machine guns have been removed, stripped out entirely, making room for something far more valuable, far more secret. Mounted inside the fuselage behind armored plating and precision glass lenses sits a camera. Not the sort you might take on holiday, but a highly specialized optical instrument capable of capturing photographs with such extraordinary detail from altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet that analysts on the ground would be able to count individual vehicles in enemy convoys, identify the layout of fortifications, and trace the movements of troops preparing for invasion. The pilot, a young man in his 20s with steady hands and steadier nerves, makes his final checks. He knows that what he is about to do is considered impossible by many in high command. The risks are extraordinary. Enemy fighters patrol these skies relentlessly. The cold at operational altitude will freeze exposed skin in minutes. Yet he climbs into the cockpit, fires up his engine, and prepares to fly directly over enemy-occupied France. For what he carries in his belly is not a weapon in the traditional sense, but it may prove more valuable to Britain's survival than any bomb or bullet. This is the story of how a small nation, standing alone against a mechanized empire, developed the most sophisticated aerial reconnaissance camera the world had ever seen, and how that camera became the eyes through which British commanders could read the intentions of their enemy. In the summer of 1940, Britain faced a crisis that seemed geometrically impossible to solve. Nazi Germany controlled France, held the Low Countries, and now threatened invasion across the English Channel with an air superiority that appeared almost absolute. The Luftwaffe was stronger, better supplied, and operating from bases mere minutes flying time from British soil. The Royal Air Force was being attrited at an alarming rate, losing more experienced pilots in a month than it could train in a year. Yet, it was not this immediate air threat alone that kept military planners awake at night. It was the terrifying uncertainty beneath it. What exactly was Hitler planning? How many invasion barges had been assembled in French and Belgian ports? Were the German forces massing troops along the coast? When would the invasion come, and where? These were not abstract questions. They were matters of life and death upon which the entire survival of the nation depended. The existing methods of gathering this intelligence were, quite frankly, inadequate. Spies reported fragmentary information, often weeks old and sometimes actively misleading. Conventional reconnaissance pilots flying at lower altitudes could gather photographs, but they were constantly harassed by enemy fighters. Their aircraft were slow and vulnerable, and they could only photograph relatively small areas before needing to withdraw. The Admiralty had proposed using long-range bombers fitted with cameras, but these were clumsy, slow aircraft designed for payload delivery, not photography. They could not climb to the altitudes necessary to evade enemy interception, and they were horrendously expensive to produce. What Britain needed was something that did not yet exist in any practical, operational form. It needed an aircraft that could climb higher, faster, and further than any fighter. It needed a camera so technically sophisticated that it could extract detail from photographs taken from the edge of the stratosphere. It needed to be able to overfly enemy territory with impunity, guided purely by the laws of physics and the skill of its pilots. To many officers in the Air Ministry, this seemed less like a military requirement and more like the wishful fantasy of an engineer with too much imagination and too few practical constraints to consider. The solution, when it came, emerged from the combination of three separate but crucial innovations. First, the RAF acquired a small number of Supermarine Spitfires and Merlin-powered Mosquito aircraft, then had them radically modified. All weapons were removed. All armor plating was stripped out. The fuel capacity was increased, giving them an operational range that would have been dismissed as impossible just months earlier. These aircraft could climb to 40,000 feet or higher, altitudes where the air was so thin and cold that no conventional fighter could follow. The Merlin engines, turbocharged to extraordinary pressures, pushed these modified aircraft to the very limits of aeronautical engineering. Second, the RAF recruited a small band of exceptional pilots, men like Sidney Cotton and others, who understood that speed and altitude, rather than defensive armament, were their only protection. Third, and most critically, the Air Ministry and the camera manufacturers Williamson worked together to develop a revolutionary aerial camera that would become known as the F.24. The F.24 was an engineering marvel, though to look at photographs of it today, it appears almost quaintly simple. The camera itself was built entirely from duralumin, a lightweight aluminium alloy, and measured approximately 47 centimeters in length and 25 centimeters in width. It weighed roughly 25 kilograms without its film magazines. What made it revolutionary was not its size, but what happened inside that duralumin housing. The optical system consisted of a Carl Zeiss lens of extraordinary quality, with a focal length of 20 inches, 50 centimeters, providing a field of view of approximately 15 degrees. The precision with which this lens was ground and assembled was beyond anything previously attempted in Britain. It had to be. At 30,000 feet, a photographic image of tiny details on the ground could only be captured if the lens system was of near-perfect optical quality. Even minor aberrations or imperfections would render the photographs useless. The camera was mounted with extraordinary precision on 3-axis gimbals, allowing it to be aligned and angled with minute accuracy. The film magazine held 400 feet of film, enough for between 250 and 350 exposures, depending on the shutter speed employed. The entire assembly was enclosed within a streamlined pod that could be mounted internally in the Spitfire's fuselage or externally beneath the wings of larger aircraft like the Mosquito. What made the F.24 work at such extraordinary altitudes was a combination of brilliant optical design and sheer mechanical precision. The film transport mechanism was entirely mechanical, with no electrical components that might fail in the extreme cold. Temperatures at operational altitudes routinely reached minus 50 degrees Celsius. The shutter speed could be set by the pilot before takeoff, with no adjustment possible during flight. The exposure was determined entirely by the aircraft's speed and altitude. A pilot flying at 450 miles per hour at 35,000 feet would have a shutter speed of approximately 1/300th of a second. The geometry of the lens system and the speed of the aircraft meant that this was precisely fast enough to avoid motion blur, yet slow enough to gather sufficient light for a usable image, even through the haze of the upper atmosphere. The manufacturing process was concentrated at Williamson's factory in Finsbury, London, and later at other locations as production scaled. The precision required was extraordinary. Each lens element had to be ground to within fractions of a millimeter of the specification. The mechanical film transport had to operate flawlessly in conditions that would cause most mechanisms to cease entirely. Early production of the F.24 saw perhaps 50 to 100 cameras manufactured by the end of 1940. This was not a weapon of mass production. Each camera was, in its own way, a handcrafted masterpiece, the product of hundreds of hours of skilled labor and precision engineering. The first operational sorties using the F.24 camera began in earnest in late 1940. The aircraft chosen was typically a Spitfire, often a Mark I or Mark II, stripped of everything but fuel and camera. A pilot would take off in the gray dawn, climbing steadily eastward across the channel. At 15,000 feet, he would don an oxygen mask as the aircraft climbed higher still. At 25,000 feet, the sky above had taken on an almost purple hue, and the curvature of the Earth became subtly visible. At 35,000 feet, the Spitfire was approaching the absolute ceiling of safe flight. The cold outside was beyond anything most people could imagine, beyond the range of ordinary thermometers. The pilot's hands were wrapped in electrically heated gloves, yet even so he had perhaps an hour and a half of effective operational time before he would need to turn back and begin his descent. In that time, he would fly over occupied France, perhaps skirting the coast near Calais, or penetrating inland toward Belgian or Dutch airfields. He would pass over German convoy concentrations, over invasion fleet preparations, over railway junctions and ammunition stores. The camera, mounted beneath the fuselage, would be firing on automatic intervals, capturing frame after frame of the landscape below. The pilot could not see what the camera was seeing. He was simply a delivery mechanism, keeping the aircraft level and steady whilst the camera did its work. When he returned to Benson or the other reconnaissance airfields, ground crew would immediately remove the film magazine. The negatives would be rushed to the photographic interpretation unit. Specialists trained to read these photographs, to extract meaningful intelligence from the patterns of shadows and light captured on film, would begin their work. Those who have examined the surviving photographs from 1940 and 1941 speak of their clarity and precision with obvious awe. You could look at a photograph of a German aerodrome and count the aircraft present. You could examine a convoy and identify the specific types of vehicles. You could see, in extraordinary detail, the earthen fortifications being constructed along the Channel coast, Pimpernel, as the Germans called it, their coastal defense line. This intelligence was not merely photographs. It was strategy. It was invasion warning. It was the means by which Britain could understand the true capabilities and intentions of its enemy. If you are finding this fascinating, a quick subscribe really does help. It means I can keep making these documentaries free for everyone who's interested in this extraordinary history. The German Luftwaffe possessed cameras, certainly, and some of them were optically superior to the British designs in certain respects. The Carl Zeiss optical works in Jena produced lenses that many considered the finest in the world. Yet Germany never developed a true equivalent to the British reconnaissance program, for reasons that reveal much about the strategic differences between the two nations. The Germans possessed excellent cameras, but they never married them to aircraft capable of flying at the extreme altitudes necessary to conduct truly safe reconnaissance. The German reconnaissance aircraft, types like the Bf-110 and the Ju-86, could climb reasonably high, but not high enough. At 30,000 feet, they remained vulnerable to British fighters. Furthermore, the German military command never seemed to grasp the strategic value of a dedicated, unarmed reconnaissance capability. They treated reconnaissance as an adjunct to conventional combat operations, a task for damaged bombers and fighter bombers rather than as a specialized discipline. The American approach was different again. By the time the United States entered the war in late 1941, the Americans were developing their own high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, using modified versions of the B-17 Flying Fortress bomber. The American camera systems, types like the K-17 and K-22, were competent and reliable, but they were designed to be carried in aircraft that were fundamentally bombers, not purpose-built reconnaissance platforms. The American system produced extraordinary volumes of photography, but it was never as elegant, never as efficient as the British approach. The British, constrained by resources, had been forced to innovate. They had created a system of extraordinary sophistication using minimal means. One Spitfire, one pilot, one camera, flying higher than any fighter could follow, returning with photographs that revealed more about the enemy's capabilities than all the conventional intelligence gathering methods combined. The historical impact of the F.24 camera and the reconnaissance program that grew up around it cannot be overstated, even as we must acknowledge the necessarily fragmentary nature of the historical record. The photographs taken in 1940 and 1941 provided crucial warning of the true scale of German invasion preparations and, critically, of when the invasion threat was beginning to diminish as German forces turned their attention eastward toward the Soviet Union. and this intelligence allowed the British military to begin, cautiously, to shift resources away from coastal defense and toward other priorities. The photographs of German airfield preparations allowed the RAF to understand where the Luftwaffe was concentrating its forces, information that proved invaluable during the Battle of Britain and its aftermath. Later, as the war progressed and German rocket weapons began to be developed, it was aerial reconnaissance that provided the first clear evidence of the V-1 and V-2 programs. The photograph of Peenemünde taken from altitude showed the launching facilities being constructed with extraordinary clarity. Without that evidence, Britain would have had no way to confirm the reality of the German rocket threat. The psychological impact of the reconnaissance program on German forces cannot be precisely measured, but it was surely significant. The knowledge that British aircraft could overfly German-occupied territory with apparent impunity, that no fighter could reach them, that they were constantly gathering intelligence, must have weighed upon German commanders. The innovation also proved enduring. The F.24 camera design was so fundamentally sound that modified versions remained in use well into the Cold War era. The principle of matching a dedicated, unarmed reconnaissance aircraft to a highly specialized camera system became the template for entire generations of military reconnaissance programs. When the Americans later developed their own high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, the U-2 of the 1950s and beyond, they were building upon principles that the British had pioneered during the desperate crisis of 1940. Standing once again on the airfield in early morning mist, we return to the Spitfire and its pilot. He has completed his mission and returned safely, his aircraft setting down on the grass runway with the gentle patter of tires on turf. The camera, its film magazines now heavy with captured intelligence, is being carefully removed from its pod. To a casual observer, nothing of enormous significance has occurred. A fast aircraft has climbed to an extraordinary altitude, flown over enemy territory, and returned home. The photographs it has captured will be examined by specialists in quiet offices, their contents analyzed, interpreted, and distilled into intelligent summaries that will be read by generals and air marshals. And yet, this simple act, a single aircraft carrying a single camera over the channel and back, represents a transformation in military capability. It represents the British genius for making do with limited resources by choosing innovation over brute force. It represents the application of optical engineering and aeronautical design to the problem of understanding an enemy's capabilities and intentions. It represents the principle that sometimes one carefully designed tool, operated by a skilled and brave individual, can be worth more than an entire squadron of conventional aircraft. The F.24 camera was never a weapon in the conventional sense. No one was killed by it. No infrastructure was destroyed. And yet, without it, Britain might have remained blind to the true nature of the threat it faced. Without it, strategic decisions might have been made on the basis of incomplete information and intelligence guesswork. The camera was the eye through which Britain read the mind of its enemy, and in the desperate struggle for survival that characterized 1940 and beyond, that clarity of vision was worth more than gold. Today, surviving examples of the F.24 camera are housed in the RAF Museum at Hendon, where they remain as testament to a moment when the impossible became merely the extraordinarily difficult, when brilliance, necessity, and courage combined to create something that changed the nature of warfare itself. The reconnaissance mission continues still, adapted and evolved, but fundamentally unchanged in principle from those early morning flights over occupied France. We watch the skies still, gathering intelligence, understanding our adversaries, and in so doing, we remain the heirs to the legacy of that small number of remarkable men who, 70 years ago, flew higher than anyone thought possible, carrying with them a camera that could see into the future,